We're taking you deep into the complicated world of your food supply. Whether it's a steak, salad, or slice of bread, there's a lot happening in the process of getting what you eat to your table, and you should know about it. Who owns the farmland? Who is growing your food? Do we have a secure food supply? Is our food safe? And are we stewarding the land and animals well in the process? In this 5-part series, we're pulling back the curtain and answering those questions. Don't forget to follow our podcast wherever you listen. I'm Rita Rogers.
I'm Cecily Dickey, and this is the Boom Clap podcast where culture and conviction collide.
If you're on the internet or social media in any capacity, you've likely heard Bill Gates is the largest farmland owner. That creates a lot of buzz, and quite frankly, it scares a lot of people, including me. But that's usually where the conversation ends. So today we cover the barriers to the people farming the land actually hanging on to it. We talked to Natasha Cox, who is the Regional Vice President of Farm Credit Mid-America. My husband, Levi Rogers, who's a 6th-generation farmer, and Mary Miller, who is a United States Congresswoman. We get into farmland prices, taxation, climate agenda, China, and in general, foreign-owned land.
Okay, so you guys have been friends for how many years?
Oh my goodness, that's a crazy question, right? So since 2001, right?
Yeah.
Wow.
Oh,
Yeah.
so yeah,
Well,
more than 20.
yeah, more than
That's
Well,
crazy.
like I knew,
more than our half
I
our
knew,
life.
yeah, I knew of Natasha in high school, but I didn't know you.
So what do you mean you
were
knew of her?
things together?
She was
What?
like you knew of her because she was like the popular girl or something?
No, like we didn't go to the same school or
Mm.
anything. She's from downstate Indiana,
Okay.
and I was from upstate Indiana.
Mm.
But because of being involved in an agricultural program, FFA, and 4-H and things, we just knew of each other, I guess.
Okay.
But she's a year older than me in school. And then we ended up living together in college
That's
in
so
a
cool.
very roundabout way. I think I've told you that story before, but maybe I haven't, Cecily. But
You probably have.
But
I'm
yeah,
guessing.
she was going to live at this apartment complex. I was going to live at this apartment complex, and we both had roommates that were separate. And then we
Okay.
ended up like moving in together. Or we're like, why don't we just live together? Because it would be cheaper to get a 4-bedroom than a 2-bedroom. And out of the 4 that lived together, we ended up being like the best of friends and
That's so cool.
marrying guys that were in a fraternity together. And so it's just like worked out to
I
stay
just
best
love
friends.
I just love it. Like, it just feels like a quintessential American story that there would be like this movie about these 2 girls from Indiana, just all interested in agriculture. Off to college they go and they become best friends. And there's some sort of, I don't know if you guys were in a sorority, but I'm like, I can just picture the movie. This is
We were
an
in our
American
own
story.
sorority. It was-
The movie. Oh man, I'm just glad there isn't any
Oh.
movie of it.
Man,
yeah, thank goodness.
no movie, no social media. Phew.
We had
mean,
flip phones,
yes.
so it was thank goodness for that.
One thing I'm
Mhm.
thankful for: no smartphones in college.
Absolutely, amen.
Yeah.
So yeah.
It's funny. Well, that's awesome. It's very cool
All
to
right,
see you
so-
guys together.
Being best friends, I guess I feel a bit bad having you on for this topic. Like it's your wheelhouse. This is what you do, and
No, this is
you're going to be
great.
great at this conversation. But our listeners are not going to get to hear how fun you really are, and you know what I mean? They're going to get to hear the work Natasha and not the fun Natasha that I know. But I'm really excited that you can come on and talk to us about this. So I don't know. Definitely.
Well, thank you for
wheelhouse.
that. And most people get my work, Natasha. So there's very few people that get, that get to be in my personal circle. So that's okay. But this is fun stuff. If you know me, this is actually fun stuff to talk about for me. So I
Yeah.
like this stuff.
Yep. Yeah. So I guess there's several things that I want to cover with you today, but the main thing, well, I guess to start off, maybe just talking about the change of farmland from being farmer owned to investor owned historically, like how that happened. I know on social media, you'll see a lot of people that maybe don't know a lot about farming, but are concerned with farming practices and where their food is coming from, that Bill Gates owns all this farm ground. And it's true, he does. He owns farm ground around us, you know, and so people are concerned with who owns the farm ground in America. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that's a fair question. And over time, we've definitely seen transitions, and it also really depends on how you define a person or an entity or a family farm. And a
That's a
definition
good
of a
point.
family farm is different in, everyone's mind. Rita, your nice, and Cecily's, our definition may be, two people that jointly own land together that may or may not have been handed down from generations, or maybe you're a first generation farmer. But a family farm or a family farming corporation could be, something that's seen as a conglomerate, but is still owned, right? So just because it's big, it doesn't mean that it's a family farm. And I think an interesting fact to think about is today there are like about 2.6 million owners that are individuals or families that are considered family farms today in the US. And so that's more than 2/3 of the acreage in the United States. So less than, I think, the American Farm Bureau site cited that less than 32,000 non-family farm corporations actually own farmland in the United States. But what we can't talk about is the trends and how that's changed. We haven't looked at those statistics over the last 200 years to say, since we started documenting transitions in the United States in different territories, how that's changed. It feels different though right now, right? Like it may feel different, but when you look at the facts, less than 5% today of all US farmland is owned by what would not be considered a family farm or a person.
Interesting, because I feel like what you hear like in the media or social media is actually that the kind of the opposite of that. I don't know if that's just in the world that I live in or not.
Well, that's a sexy story, right? That's a sexy story, right? That but it's all about the trends too, right? So maybe it's only 5%, but how much has that jumped over the last couple of years? And so I think those trend lines are really important for us to recognize too, because the age of the American farmer is changing.
Yeah, to like you said, the definition. So I guess the definition of family farm, like on paper, versus what I would define it as, or the people coming at it on social media would define it as. Because like you look around us and you look at farmland sales, and yes, it might be a person buying it, but I guess I'm saying the person buying it or the quote farmer buying it isn't necessarily the person farming the ground. So that does change things when you look at it from that perspective. Because we have like, yes, Bill Gates, we have the owner of not Tractor Supply. Gosh, I don't know why that's escaping me right now. Yes, Rural King. Thank you. Buying a lot of ground around us. We have the Mormon Church buying a lot of ground around us. And so there's all of these different outside investors coming in. And Levi would probably have a lot better list than I have in my head right now. But I do know there's a lot of farmers around us that own ground, that actually farm the ground. But I would say that's a much smaller percentage of ground is owned by the actual person farming it. Is that true from your perspective?
I think you see a lot of part-time farmers, or what you would call absentee landowners. And you can go, there's some sources that I can cite for you guys to follow up on where you can actually look by state. And Cecily, I'm sorry, I don't know that how widely published Canada does with that information. I don't have a lot. I do have some information about Canada and just foreign ownership in the US. But when you look at that, absentee ownership has been on the rise. And I think that directly correlates to some extent with the age of the American farmer, right? Less than 2% of Americans are actively engaged in production agriculture. And as we see the average age of the farmer rising, I think it makes sense, right? That you're just there's more barriers to entry. You're having fewer people enter into the market. Cap rates are lower right now. So we're actually seeing less institutional investors invest in farmland in the US than we maybe would have the last couple of years. And we can get into that a little bit about the difference between institutional buyers or investors compared to maybe family investors. And, when we look at statistically in the United States, I think 80% of the farmland last year, based on some studies from Schrader's, Halderman's, and other farm management companies, actually came from farmers. Farmers bought the land, and they would define that as people that are actively going to farm. And then that other 20% is made up of institutional buyers and other investors. Institutional buyers have backed off a little bit right now in some areas of the country
Yeah.
because farmland values have just got so high that it's not a good
Not a
rate
good
of return. The stock market's
Yeah.
been performing. You know that we can go put money into a CD, and you can get a higher rate of return than you would on farm ground. So those dynamics kind of ebb and flow with different economic indicators, but it's the trends that we're watching. And for me, it's really important when you think about food being a national security issue, right? So everybody wants to make sure that they can take care of the supply chain as far as food goes. And so you think about land ownership, one, pride in it, but then if you look at it on the basic needs of our country, it's about being able to control your food supply, but also overall national security as well.
Yeah. You touched on almost everything I want to get into, so I'm not exactly sure where I want to go next because I don't want to forget to go any of the places. But you talked about the American Farm Bureau and the statistics that they had recently put out that were based, I think, on the USDA Ag Report. I think this was just maybe a few months ago, but I had pulled a quote out from it. It said the latest census numbers show that the number of farmers over the age of 65 is outpacing young farmers. Almost 1.3 million farmers are now at or beyond retirement age, while just 300,000 farmers are under the age of 35.
Right.
How many are under the age of 35?
300,000. And 1.3 million are at or above retirement age.
And when you think about it from a GDP perspective and our contribution to the world here in the United States to growing our own food, but also providing food to the rest of the world, you think in 2 generations, that's pretty scary, right? You look at those 35-year-olds, and if you see that continues to slow. And Rita, I think some of that really comes back to just a lot of the barriers to entry as well, the affordability, things that we take pride on is, ownership of land. But also if you don't have land that can be transitioned to you, it's a little harder to do that if you're thinking about traditional crops. You also think about innovation in agriculture, and ag tech funds are some of the hottest funds that are out there, right? Everybody or a lot of people want to invest in ag tech funds, ag startups, and innovation because we know that labor is just a tremendous issue on the farm, whether that be for farm ownership, but also just being able to work on the farm. And so that's a glaring statistic that says who's going to raise our food in the future? Are we going to raise our food the same in the future as we do today? If how commercialization versus small plot farms, what does that look like, and how do we continue to do that in harmony while making sure that we talk about energy independence, but we definitely don't want to get in a situation where we don't have food independence as well.
Yeah, exactly. You talk about how are we going to be doing it? Something we're thinking like it would be better to get back to doing things a little more naturally, but that's not how things are going to go when you have less people doing the work, right?
Yeah. I think, it's the reality of it, right? And then you have urbanization and rural sprawl. And, we continue to have a growing population. Our population centers tend to be focused in urban areas just because of the resources that we all know, jobs, internet, all those things. But then you come out and you say, who's going to continue to want to come back and, farm land in your county, Rita? Are your girls going to be interested in doing that? Maybe they will, maybe they won't. But at the end of the day, as we look at some of our questions around institutional investors, what are their plans for that? Right? Are there plans to, a lot of them are really involved with the ESG movement. And so a lot of these farms that are being purchased may be built into some of the climate smart conversations and the subsidies. Not all of them, but some of them are today. And so you ask yourself, is the attractiveness there if the subsidies don't exist and the incentive don't exist? Or are there other motives to control the land base? Because if you control the land base, you control the food. And if you control the food, fiber, and fuel, you control the people per se, right?
Yeah. That's why,
Wow.
like, that's why this is a series. That's why this is not a
Mhm.
one-off episode, because the food supply thing can be so simplified on social media and sound bites be put out. And it's so complex, really. Everything you see going on in the world, as far as like the ESG you brought in, the climate, like all of that, it applies to agriculture. It applies to our food supply, right? So I guess I want to go back for a second and tell our listeners why you know about this. Like, what do you do for a living? Because people are
Just
going
a
to be like, why
genius.
does she have all
Yeah.
these random farm statistics?
Uh, for a living, I actually work for an agricultural finance cooperative. So I work within the farm credit system, providing finance, capital, and resources to farmers, ranchers, and even rural residents around the United States. Hyper focused here in the Midwest. I have a degree in agricultural economics from Purdue University. And so that's really where my love of combining numbers with people and telling a story and helping people began is there. And then we also operate a family farm as well. And so that connection back to what we do here, constantly looking for more innovative ways, also more profitable ways to run our business as well, while respecting the environment and those around us, and living in a world that's constantly changing and is not just domestic, but is international, right? If somebody sneezes in China, it impacts US agriculture, right? Like literally, you can feel the sneeze
Yes.
across the world. I think somebody said that. The sneeze felt across the world. And that's
Mhm.
crazy. Like our grandfathers did not have to deal with that, but they also did not have to they didn't have the opportunities that we've also been afforded, when you think about margins as well. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunities for US agriculture and agriculture in general ahead. But it's a very complicated subject these
Oh,
days.
yeah. I mean, my head has been spinning lately with just these existential questions about globalization in general. Like just the fact that we know what's going on everywhere, what happens
Mm-hmm.
here affects what happens there, et cetera. And I can't even begin a conversation about that here because, like I said, it feels so existential to me, just how I feel about all of it. But you're right. Like it is a sneeze in China is felt here. So what I've been noticing here is that there seems to be, and I don't know if it's like a trend or if these people last, but there's a lot of people that move out from like Vancouver to my area to start like a farming business of some sort, like either a hobby farm just for themselves that they can produce food, or some of them have actually created like successful like niche businesses. So I don't know if they're doing it because just land is more affordable here. And when I say that, I still mean it's about $100,000 an acre for farmland, but it's more affordable than what you find out in Vancouver. Or if it's people have this desire to get back to those roots of, like Rita had said earlier, the more traditional farming. But I don't know if these people would be considered like farmers in those statistics that we talked about earlier, where so many of them are over 65. And of course, that's the states. And so few are under 35. I don't know, like you would know more about that, but I don't know if it's the trends that people are like wanting to connect to their roots or if it's just they're looking for something that's more affordable.
Yeah, I don't know. An observation that I've made is, since COVID, that there was a great rural revitalization that went on, right? People wanting or appearing to want free space to be able to protect what's important to them. And that includes food supply, access to natural resources that they need. And so you've seen I think, some hypersensitive words where we've all used that rural revitalization and things like that. The USDA, which I'm not saying that is a trusted resource, but the USDA, there's different definitions of how you define a farmer, right? And $500 of gross farm income could be defined as a farmer, right? So those numbers and statistics we talked about, when you get down to the number of people that are actually producing the fuel, food, and fiber that goes on the market, that's even a much smaller number than that 2%. But agritourism and, the ability to utilize different marketing activities to interact with the public and showcase what agriculture is, I think has been on the rise the last couple of years. And I do think that social media has helped that. I think that social media has helped to activate these opportunities to engage with food supply and create experiences around that, the natural resources that we have that we didn't have, a decade ago.
Right. It's almost like it's opened a window or a door for people to see, like, this is how people live in some areas of the country or the continent or the world. And it's available for you too. I think so many people who live super urban, it's very easy to become disconnected with how food is actually produced, right? And so I think you're right in saying that social media has kind of opened that window for people to see, and it might just create that stirring inside of them for something different, right?
In the process of food processors and manufacturers, and then back to the producer that's producing the raw commodity, they want a story to tell. And I think a lot of that comes back to consumer preferences. What are consumers demanding? I always say farmers will grow what consumers want. They really have no preference to some extent. You're going to have, but most producers that you sit down and talk to say, if the world is demanding that I grow this, or that's what consumers want, then, I could shift my operation potentially to grow the needs of the world, right? Or what consumers are going to be willing to pay for at the end of the day. And so I think that that's just important that, a lot of times what happens on the farm shifts with consumer behaviors. And that really was different 2 decades ago or a generation ago, right? We were really focused on raw commodities, and that's it. Very raw commodities. Transparency and what happened was not part of the markup that you've seen in the grocery store right now. Now you're paying extra, or somebody's paying for the fact that you're going to know that Rita and Levi grew a bushel of corn that eventually turned into this food grade corn chip, right? Somebody has to pay for that. Someone's profiting off of that. And I think we just have to ask ourselves the questions of, what is food transparency? How important is it to the food supply? What does that mean? What role does the farmer play? What role does the processor play? What role does the grocer or retailer play? And who's making money off of this, right? What is the intentions of it? Is it truly to let you know where your food's coming from, or is it just another branding technique?
Good point. Yeah.
That's a really good point. And I don't know, you think about, some of Cecily and I talked about greenwashing the other day. I mean, that's happening with food too. There's marketing techniques that kind of twist things just a little bit. Like we had, I don't remember what the conversation or why the conversation came up, but talking about grass-fed beef. And I was like, well, the grass-fed beef you see in the supermarket is probably not what people think grass-fed actually means. Like they think grass-fed means this cow was fed grass the entirety of their life. But grass-fed, all cows are grass-fed at some point or get hay. And so they can put that on anything and they might be grain finished. And I'm not saying that's bad or right or wrong how the cow is raised. I'm not qualifying what someone should buy. I'm just saying it is it is tricky labeling to label something grass-fed and people think it's grass-fed, but it's actually been grain finished, And so it's that food transparency you're talking about. Is it actually transparent or is it a marketing technique sometimes as well?
Yeah, I think that you walk into a store and, first and foremost, I support all type of agricultural practices that make sense, obviously, that are humane and all those things. And so I'm not levying one after the other or a consumer's preference on what they consume in their body. But that mislabeling in the grocery store, typically there's a monetary incentive for that, right? And so free range, organic, antibiotic free is a huge one that, they may label something antibiotic free, but actually antibiotics are never given, to that particular, protein source. And so that, those things, as a consumer, but also a producer, you scratch your head at and you say, okay, this is just something that we may be capitalizing on because there's a certain segment of consumers that say, we want this. And so then they're finding ways to monetize that for themselves. And I think that really just comes back to educating yourself as a buyer, right? Using your money wisely, knowing what is important to you and your family, protecting that at all costs, and using your dollars to vote for that, but also not falling into a deep hole as it pertains to those that are just trying to do a money grab on you and your family.
Yeah. Okay, so getting back to farmland and how young farmers are getting into farming and whether someone has land to pass on to them and things, can we talk about taxation a little bit and quote the death tax? I know states have different rules. Some states have an inheritance tax, some states don't, but federally there is. And when the person who does not farm looks at that number, they're like, no one, only the really rich have that kind of money. So of course they should be taxed. But from my perspective, as somebody who is in a farming family, it does not take very long when land is at the price it is at to get to those numbers. And when you look at, say, you've got $2 million worth of farm ground or something, that sounds like a crazy number to someone. But you're not passing on, when you pass on farm ground, you're not passing on $2 million. You're passing on farm ground that makes a little bit of money. And you only have $2 million from that farm ground if you're selling it. And so if our goal as consumers is to keep people in farming, keep small farmers in farming, this tax has to be looked at, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think right now it's set to phase out in 2025, and every couple of years, Congress brings that to the table to potentially repeal it. We're able to get some traction. I think right now, when you look at it, you're a little over $12 million per individual, and then that can be transitioned to your spouse as well. And so when you think about that and the appreciation that's happened to U.S. farmland over the last several years, but a cap rate of maybe only a 2 or 3% return, that becomes really, really important, but also impactful when we think about the ability for us to continue to do what we do best with productive farmland, and that's farm it, and maybe not potentially have to liquidate it.
Explain the cap rate of 2 to 3%.
Okay. Cap rate is a quick calculation where you look at the value of an asset and then the potential, whether it would be a rental rate that you could rent that out, or a lease rate that you could, or a net income calculation. Cap rate is used to compare farmland, for one, as to the stock market and other rate of returns that you can get. So it's typically a rate of return that you're going to be able to get on that piece of farmland. Yes. And so there's a disconnect, there's a decoupling of that compared to other assets maybe that you may have that are quickly convertible to cash, or their annualized income is much higher. Also, farmland is just, continues to be appreciated by influences outside of agriculture at times, a lot of the urban sprawl that influences that, not really the action. And that's when you see that happening like we do today, where you have a low cap rate, but you have a very high asset valuation on that. And so we've had a lot of folks, including several senators across the United States, congressmen, congresswomen, and organizations like in the U.S., American Farm Bureau, your different commodity groups that go to the table every single day. But that's a grab. That's a grab. When the CBO is doing scoring of the next budget year, they're going to go out and they're going to look for ways to be able to fund this national debt that we have that is just ridiculous, right? One way that you can traditionally look at some of that is they can look at it and say, well, okay, here's an easy grab. We can look at all the farmland in the United States. We can look at the rising death rates potentially of U.S. farmers, and we can say, this estate tax is pretty aggressive, and that it's impacting it, and so that's always going to be something that's up for discernment anytime that it comes to the table or is put into legislation. And luckily, I think for U.S. agriculture, it's not kept up with inflation, but we've been able to keep it at a level that it is impactful for a family farm. The exemption levels that we have today, as far as the estate tax goes, it's gonna cover a lot of family farms that are out there. However, you have some states that are going to come in with capital gains taxes. And so anything over that level that you could be paying 40 or 50%, right?
Illinois is bad.
Yeah.
Yeah. So say, like, for example, when we started farming, ground was around, I don't know, not when we started farming, but like when we got married, because Levi was farming before that. I feel like ground was maybe like $7,000 or so an acre, and Levi might have a different take on that, but I'm pretty sure that's about right. And now it's like 18 or so, so in the last 17 or so years, it's appreciated that much. And so when you look at a state coming in and taking capital gains on that, it's really hard to think about passing that. How do you pass that on to your children, without having to sell farm ground off to someone else? And if you want to keep that in family farmers' hands, the legislation that's happening to look at, like you said, covering our budget, our debt rather, potentially on the backs of farmers that are getting old. I don't know. That's a scary thing to think about. I mean, even for the consumer that has no skin in this game, as far as owning farm ground goes,
Yeah, the IRS sets these limits and the values that are subject to the taxation. And, that's crazy in itself. There are more than a dozen states that have, outside of that, they impose their own estate taxes in the United States, and 6 actually have an inheritance tax as well. So, I mean, those are just, when you think about double and triple taxation, it's really crazy. And really, I think the point of the conversation is, how do we make sure that farming stays important, but also it's a national security risk. And I think that's a lot of the power that comes to the table when we're able to tell the story of the family farms. It's very hard for those to be empathetic to a corporation or a business that's already asking for abatements and different things like that. But when you can go to the table and tell the story of the American farmer, the good works that we do, or the Canadian farmer, the good works that you do in the world, the preservation of the food supply chain, and then really look at the appreciation that happens in the evaluations, but also the volatility that happens in the valuations that's tied to net income. But there's a lot of people out there that say, pay your fair share, right?
That's what I mean. That's what I want to get at, is like the listener who might think like, we hear tax the rich all the time. And that's the thing, like, I want to drive home is the person that may be rich on paper because they own a big asset is not necessarily, quote, rich. And I'm not saying that it's even right to say tax the rich. I'm not saying that, like saying, oh, but we're actually poor, so don't tax us, but still tax the rich. Not what I'm saying. I'm just saying, like, I want people to understand, especially when it comes to farming, people that look loaded on paper and that would fall into that tax the rich category are not living the lifestyle of the rich, because it's tied up in production ag, right?
Yeah.
And it's not producing that kind of income that one would think, anyway.
So agriculture in general is a very capital intense industry.
Yep.
It's actually one of the most capital intense industries that there are in the world, whether it be access to capital, but also just what it takes to operate compared to the annualized income, and that's hard to get your head around. It's also very sad to see family farms liquidate because of these conversations that we're having today. There's a lot of tools that you can put in play to help with that, though, and then that leads to the conversation about ownership of land. And so a lot of families may form corporations or LLC or shelter trust or even REITs themselves in order to protect those assets where, 50 years ago, that would have just been held as sole proprietors. And so they're leveraging some of the tools and resources they have for proper estate planning so that the farm can continue, so that they can hand that down to the next generation, and we can continue to, produce the food, fiber, and fuel. But it's a real conversation every year when that comes up for debate, or every couple of years when that comes up for debate in Congress. Everybody's got to be willing to go to work on it. And right now, those estate tax exemptions, as far as agriculture goes, is not keeping pace with the asset value appreciation and inflation. So,
yeah, I don't know. I hate the fact, I know this is how the world works, and like you have to plan for the future and plan for your retirement and plan for the transition to the next generation and all that. But it just doesn't, as a Christian, this does not feel like how it was intended. It doesn't feel like it was designed where we should be like fighting with the government all the time and like filling lawyers' pockets to help get their help with like estate planning and everything else. Like, it just does not seem like that's how, well, we know how God designed things and we messed it up, right? But anyway, I don't know. That's neither here nor there, I guess, but
I think
it
it
just
is.
feels not right.
It's hard to think about having to pay for something that you've already paid for over and over and over
Over
again.
and over again. Yep.
Right. That's really, really hard. And also when we think about medium incomes, and not that that is the intent, but you wonder why we can't change that, right? And we have these huge disparities in income. It's because the taxation typically happens right on the middle class. And they're paying for things over and over and over and over again. And most family farms are going to fall into that middle class territory, if not the lower class. And so it's really hard to think about that and fathom of how we got here as a country, right? Like how we got here as a country. I mean, I guess the good side of that is we're not part of the, the CCP in China, where we have no ability to own land, right? But that doesn't
Yep.
make it right just because we're the best house on a bad block. Right.
It
Government
doesn't make it
over.
right that we have to essentially rent it forever from
Yeah,
the
we
government.
do. Your taxes,
Like you
will
buy it, then rent it on the side.
That's right. You're exactly right. We're truly renting all of our assets, but I think all of us are feeling that. And Cecily, I'm not sure if this doesn't need to become, into monetary and fiscal policy, but I mean, all of us, I think, are continuing to feel the pressure of taxation based on ill spending of our federal governments. I mean, it is just, whether it's a house that you own in town, or it's a family farm that you own, or a business. One of the biggest concerns of those individuals when I speak with them in the financial industry is just the continual rising cost of taxation that's indexed to inflation and appreciation that, honestly really appears to be, we're not going to use the word transitory anymore. It's not transitory. It's poor monetary and fiscal policy that was applied that got us here. And now we're having to pay for those bad deeds, and we can't afford to do that.
Well, and it's also connected, right? From the top to the bottom. And so people might be listening to this thinking, oh, I don't have family in farming. So it really doesn't matter to me too much about this death tax and, not too many young farmers or how hard it is to get into it. But it should worry. I don't like to say it should worry people. I don't want people to live in fear or anything. But like you said at the beginning of this, when we think a couple generations down the road, what is access to our food going to look like? Even just the taxation, we've seen it here in Canada. I know you guys have seen the same, just the rising cost of food, just because of all the taxation and all of the policy. Yeah. It's absolutely insane. And it's hard to see it getting better just because it seems we just keep adding these things, It's just we don't take away. We add on thinking that, this add-on might help in some way, but it ends up just adding on.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely.
You brought
and
up
the consumer is usually going to pay for that. The consumer and the producer are usually going to pay for that, not the middleman, the marketer, the processor.
And possibly in more than one way.
Absolutely.
Not always just monetarily and quality and all of that as well. So you brought up the CCP. Can we just get into China and its investment in U.S. ag for a little bit and recent legislation? I know you're in Indiana, and I think Indiana just had legislation against China buying U.S. farm ground.
Yeah, House Bill 1183 in Indiana is set to be signed into law this July. And so that legislation was brought to the table by Representative Culp. He actually just lives about 30 miles to the north of us. That conversation started out of a land use study in the state of Indiana that just said, kind of, where is our farmland going? What's happening? Is it really disappearing? If it is disappearing, what are the uses for that farmland that we're taking out of production? And then who are the investors or those that are taking ownership of this land as it's transitioning out of production agriculture? We have about 16 million acres of productive agriculture land in in Indiana. And so that study is just being finished up, but our legislators brought that to the table. And I think if that law is signed into play, we would be the 25th state in the United States to have a law against foreign adversaries owning farmland in the United States. And in the state of Indiana, foreign adversaries are defined by the federal government. And so our state isn't defining who that is, but Russia, China, are some of the big ones that are on there today. North Korea that you have. And so Indiana's aligned with the federal government on that to say no foreign adversary can have ownership. We don't have a law that's retroactive though. So if there was already ownership in the state, some states have actually did a clawback law that said, hey, let's claw back. We're actually going to take that into receivership. Any foreign adversary that owns land, and you're no longer going to be able to own that land in Indiana. And so I think that that's interesting. And then you look at the statistics and you say, how much land does China actually own in the United
That was
States?
going to be my question.
Yeah, like how much do they actually own? So 3.1% of U.S. ag land was foreign owned. Okay. So 96.9% of land in the United States, agriculture land, was owned by U.S. citizens. When you break down that 3.1% of that, actually, Cecily, our friends in Canada actually are some of the largest owners. They're almost 1%. And a lot of that comes in Maine. So you think forest land, not necessarily your traditional row crop or vegetable or fruit producers, that's going to come in a lot of timber type of ground in Maine, actually, where you share borders, right? And so that kind of makes sense. China, when you look at the 3.1%, is actually only 0.03%.
Wow.
So it's a couple 100,000 acres that are owned by China in the United States. So if we step back and we said, that's really not that much, right? So why are these states putting these laws in place for these foreign adversaries? And I think if we think about globalization, but we think about our national defense systems, we say, okay, there's some things that we need to do, not to change what's already happened, but to protect things from happening. Kim China owns Syngenta in the United States, Smithfield. And so it's not just farmland, right? Like it's processors, it's meat processors, Smithfield, the largest pork producing. I'm not saying that's bad or good. I'm just saying these are all things to be aware of how much control adversaries have of our food supply system. And there are all different ways to threaten your national security beyond using weapons, right? Food is a weaponization that can be used. Your food supplies can be, so I think that that's just interesting. And so the state of Indiana, hopefully that'll be signed into law. And I know that our economic development teams, right now, I think there's 12 projects in the state of Indiana, potentially where Chinese companies are, looking at relocating or building new factories in the state of Indiana. And, states are always wanting to welcome industry that's going to create jobs, right? Because jobs create livelihoods for your citizens. And that's important. But I think our state legislator in the state of Indiana stepped back and said, it's not that we're not open for business, but we're not open for business with adversaries at this point. And that seems like a really strong statement. But the state of Indiana's legislator decided that that was really important in our citizens. It actually passed unanimously. So really? It was something that we were actually able to vote on in Indiana. A lot of these states, if you look at them, are going to be traditionally Republican states that you see these things coming on. But when they go to vote, I think it's really interesting that the bipartisanship is there, and they've usually been passed because people say, "Hey, that makes sense, right? That makes sense."
Yeah. Yeah. So when you talk about, I think you said that they started studying this. This is the last thing I really want to get to. They started this legislation based on studies of decreasing farmland in the state. Yep. And I'm going to go back to that USDA report where they said that the 2022, so this article came out in 2024, but it was based on the 2022 census of agriculture, that there were 141,000 plus fewer farms in 2022 than 2017. And the number of farm acres fell to 880,000, which was a loss of more than 20 million acres from just 5 years earlier. So I guess if our farm acres are falling and we're not having as much land in production ag, what is that going to? And this is a tack on question. I know that's not going to be the bulk of the rationale, but is solar and wind and all of that stuff, what role does that play?
Yeah, I think when we think about, and we can provide you with some information on that. Right now, the number of acres, most acres in the United States, I think, truly are lost to urbanization, right? So
Okay. Yeah.
housing
That
and
makes the
that,
most
and so
sense. Yeah.
statistically, solar and or renewable energy in general, including solar and wind, isn't going to get on that chart as a big mover when you think about the total acres. Now, situationally, in markets, we're going to feel that. I feel that in my,
Yeah. Like
in
we have
my
like
area.
1,000 acres just south of us, in
Yeah.
solar. It's like a solar sprawl.
Yeah. And so you look at that and you say, what is the future of that? What is our intent? What type of subsidies are going to continue to drive this? I mean, in Indiana, I think we have less than 150 days of sunlight truly throughout, the year. And so you say, is this really, if this works and if it was, the best practice and making assumption, is Indiana really the best place for these to be placed, or Illinois? I think
Or is
that's a
California
question
better? I think
that I have.
California is better.
Yeah, right. Yeah, but we all
Where
know
these
for the most part,
policies originate from.
we all know why these things are here, because you have counties like I live in where there's less than 8,000 people.
Yep.
Your population per land mass, your population density is very low, and so it's very easy to present these concepts there. Also, they are additional ways for landowners or absentee landowners to earn incentives or profits in a markets that can be very volatile, and we could spend time in that, right? So they're incenting with potential profits that won't be there, and so at the end of the day, Rita, I'd say I don't know that the land that's going out of production is dramatically being impacted today by renewable energy type of things, but I do know that it's something on the rise. So it goes back to that aggressive trend line that we have. And I think there's a statistics, I think we lose 27 acres a minute of farmland to urban sprawl or expansion. And then you say, well, how are we going to continue to feed the world? Well, you say we're also producing, take a corn farmer, right? That raises production corn, that you're producing, 260 bushels an acre on the same land that your grandfather maybe produced 150 on. So we're becoming more productive all the time. And so that's why you're seeing world ending stocks be at a record. And you're also seeing countries like South America that are bringing land into production all the time, right? So as we lose land, they're bringing land into production. And so I think it gets lost in translation sometimes, what's going on at a local level, right? Like what is going on at a hyper local level. And you can be years, those are really going to be headwinds versus tailwinds, and lagging indicators versus leading indicators. And sometimes our children may wake up and say, wow, right? Where did all the farmland go? And how do we respond to that? And if we're there, I think it's a national security issue at that point. And hopefully our federal government is willing to partner with us to protect assets that we actually already own, so that we can continue to not only feed the world, but preserve what is already ours.
Yeah. I want to correct my numbers really quick. I copied that quote over and pasted it so I could see it on my screen. And so I said 880,000. It said fell to 880 million, losing 20 million acres. So I just want to make sure that's correct in here for our listeners.
Conservation, Rita, is, and I haven't dug into that number, but that's something sometimes as you look at different conservation programs that are put out, that sometimes land is taken out of production because it's put into conservation programs. So that impacts that number as well. So just not to say that it takes away, I think, from the messaging and what's happening and, the question of where's all the farmland going. But some of those numbers can change just based on different programs, conservation incentive programs, or incenting farmers to take that land out of production temporarily.
All valid things to look at for sure. So it's a lot of numbers, guys. This is why I brought Natasha to the party, because this is not like going through I don't know. We look at things through a different lens sometimes, and it's really good. It makes our conversations interesting. So I appreciate that.
Well, I appreciate all the work that you two are doing. And I love the fact that you're here to ask questions. You're being curious. You're not leading people down one path or the other. You're just opening up conversations so that, we can make better decisions for ourselves and our family and hopefully our world. Because regardless of, where we all live on this planet, we're all interconnected and interrelated, and we're impacted by the decisions each of us make every single day. And so I think what you guys are doing is really, really cool and really important.
Oh, yep. Thank you. That's very kind.
Yes, it is. Thanks for coming on, Natasha. Love you.
Oh, no problem.
Recession and inflation are here. There is a growing sense of instability and uncertainty with food, gas, housing, and everyday items increasing monthly. Food prices have the nation reeling. This is why we want to tell you guys about ARC heirloom seeds. They have seen a 10-time increase since the pandemic, showing the desire and necessity to grow your own healthy food. ARC Seed Kits is a family-owned and operated small business located on a 40-acre farm in northern Michigan. ARC has been growing and saving heirloom seeds to send across the nation and world for over 15 years. Their mandate is to help prepare every home in America with the food and economic security by having the ability to grow their own food from having heirloom seeds. The need will be great, and ARC wants you to be prepared. 95% of seeds on the market today are hybrid, not having the ability to reproduce. Heirloom seeds make up the other 5%, which is how they provide reproduction year after year. Having heirloom seeds offers both food stability and security. Many leading economists and investors believe that heirloom seeds could become a source of currency in the near future. ARC desires to equip every home in America with the ability to grow and harvest its own food. This led to the creation of the All-in-One Seed Kit. The All-in-One Seed Kit has over 65 varieties and 50,000 seeds, which is so many, neatly packaged inside a container with a shelf life of over 15 years. It is designed to grow nutrient and calorie-dense vegetables and fruits to sustain any home at any time. Included in it is a seed guide that gives the owner the knowledge and information to grow and harvest every variety that ARC has to offer. We have partnered with ARC to offer a 10% discount code. Go to arcseedkits.com and enter BoomClap to get your 10% discount and be on your way to food and economic security, helping you, your family, and your community. Remember, the need will be great and ARC wants you to be prepared. So please visit arcseedkits.com, enter code BoomClap, and order your seed kits today.
This is my husband, Levi. He is my other half. And I guess you can kind of go into what kind of farming you do. I guess you can tell our listeners that first.
Yeah. We're involved in row crop farming. I farm with my brother and my dad. And we grow corn, soybeans, and a little bit of alfalfa, but just mainly corn and soybeans. Corn is majority food production, corn, and non-GMO soybeans, and we also grow soybean seed.
Okay.
And that's
See, already I've learned something because I have heard from so many people. Well, okay, so you said the corn is food production and then that the soy is non-GMO soy. Is that also for food production or for animals?
Food.
Like for people or for animals?
For people, a lot of it goes overseas.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, because I've heard like when I'm going to buy feed and stuff for our animals from people in the feed industry and not, and of course this is animals, I don't know if it's different for people, but I've heard from so many people that it's like there's no such thing as non-GMO soy. So that's obviously not true. Or that like any soy produced in like high yield crops is always GMO.
No, that's not true. Like it's non-genetically modified, but it's not organic. It's
right.
Of course, there's a big difference there, but the seed is it's not modified seed.
Yeah.
And we've done it for many years, but there's a few more things involved with it, but you get used to it. Like, you know what to do, what to look for, but it's basically like raising regular modified seed. Just mainly it's more paperwork to go through. The outlets where we sell grain is obviously a lot farther away. So we spend a lot more time in semi hauling the grain. But and we just do it for a premium. We just get more.
Oh, I see.
Just dollars per bushel.
Yeah. And the paperwork that goes along with it, I mean, like you said, it's not organic, but I know that like when something's certified organic, there's obviously a lot of paperwork and legwork and legal stuff. So it's probably the same with non-GMO. Like that extra paperwork is just covering your bases.
Not to that extent, but they just want to, like the producers or the processors we sell to. It's the same ones year after year. They just need to be able to track their product back to us and make sure it is,
what it says it is.
Yeah, it truly is non-GMO. Okay. But they test it, like every load gets tested for the traits, and they just take samples and grind it with a coffee grinder basically, and do a litmus test, and hopefully don't get rejected. But
interesting.
Well, we were just talking before we came on here. This is probably the most nervous I've ever been to record. It's interesting that, like,
that's funny.
So on this episode, we're going to have one of my best friends, and then we're going to have my husband. And with her, I was probably the least nervous I've ever been, but with him, I'm nervous. And I don't know why that is. I think mainly because we're probably, covering our territory, what we do. And that's nerve-wracking in itself a little bit. But we wanted to have you on, and you were a bit reluctant, I think mainly just because talking on a podcast. But every time I have conversations with you about farming, it's surprising to me sometimes because we are conventional farmers, but a lot of the things that I think and that I hear going on, like we were listening to a podcast with a regenerative farmer, and you're like, well, a lot of what he says is right. It's just a matter of if you can do it and if it's sustainable economically as well. And so it's surprising sometimes the answers you have. And I think it's good to have your perspective on this episode. But this episode in particular, we're talking about food supply from the aspect of where does our food come from? Who's growing it? Why is it hard for small farmers to keep farm ground? Why is it hard for farmers themselves to own farm ground and not outside investors? And so that's a lot of the reason I wanted to have you on this episode, specifically to talk about that from a farmer's perspective. So I guess one of the big conversations, we talked to Natasha a bit about this, is on social media, people are like, Bill Gates is the largest farmland owner in the United States. And people don't like that. People do not like the idea of Bill Gates controlling farm ground. And whether it's Bill Gates or not, there is a lot side of outside investment in our area and all over the United States, right?
Yeah, and there has been for a while, but it's pretty heavy. I mean, I'm guessing it's here in the Midwest, I'm guessing it's like that all over. But yes, like to purchase ground, the inflation played a big part in it. The price breaker has skyrocketed in the last handful of years. But yeah, there is, when you're a small farmer trying to compete with someone that does not farm, that has outside money coming in, makes it very, very difficult. But
it's difficult to buy ground.
Yeah, difficult to purchase. But
for sure. And go ahead.
Maybe I should have clarified earlier. Like what we farm, we own a little bit, we own some of it, but we also crop share some of it, and we actually rent some of it. So there's kind of three aspects of the farm ground, or three different ways that we have ground to farm. But it's divided up by all three. So obviously, the more you own, the simpler it is, just because you actually own it. But it takes a lot to get to that point to to get it paid for, and get it behind you, and you're not paying interest on it. It's income then. But
can you explain that just a little bit better for our listeners to understand? Because I think that when people think of a farmer, they think the farmer is farming something they own. And when it comes to farming like you do or we do, which when you go drive around and you see a soybean field or a corn field, first of all, the corn is not like sweet corn that you eat. That's not what you're saying.
You should
clarify that because I think that's
on the cob you get at
that's a huge misconception. I think
supermarket. It's the food corn is for like chips mainly, tortillas, stuff like that. We grow white corn and yellow corn, both are food corn.
I know this isn't exactly what we're talking about, but here we have like two corn crops that we grow. Cow corn, we call it cow corn, and people corn, which is the sweet corn. So there's something in between kind of like that is used for those corn product foods.
Yes.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So it's human consumption.
Mm-hmm.
Other than it's not like your canned corn or corn on the cob.
It's like a hard corn.
Yeah, they process it, mill it,
okay.
and but what we do, a lot of it goes for your corn chips.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
back to like owning ground. A lot of farmers are farming partially what they own and then what someone else owns, but making some profit off of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because you're doing, you get the labor and the equipment. But yeah, there might be an outside owner, maybe someone, family friend. We farm for family friends. We farm for people that live all over the United States, in various places. And then,
but own ground here.
Yeah, they own ground here. Maybe there are, generations before them had grew up on a farm here, and they've just passed it down, kept the farm in the family for many years. But they've moved off, and people have passed on, and it just kind of went down through the generations. And hopefully they don't sell it. But what the price stuff is, there's a lot of stuff that's came for sale last year. It's kind of slowed down here in the last few months, but a lot of people finally said, that's a lot of money, and put it up for auction or sale or list it. So.
No, especially if it's been in the family for generations and they're not farming it themselves, they just look at that as incentives a lot of the time. Like, oh, I could actually make a lot on this because I'm not personally invested in it aside from just financially, right? So that's interesting. And as a farmer, like with your ear to the ground, do you hear of a lot of land being sold to like someone who's totally not local or a corporation? Like, do you hear of that happening often, like when these sales are being made?
Yeah, every one of them is.
Wow.
If it's one of any size, there's bidders from all over.
Wow.
Like local people do buy ground, but there is always outside bidders. And
right.
I think what he's saying is partially it's just like hard for a small farmer to compete against that kind of, when somebody's coming in with, millions of dollars in the bank, and then there you are as a local farmer just wanting to buy a bit of ground, their pocketbook's a lot bigger and they can go a lot deeper and go higher on a price. So like when you talk about buying farm ground, I think one of the things maybe we covered a little bit with Natasha was just that it's hard to see the numbers on paper and to pencil that out, because one thing we've talked about is buying farm ground, like us buying farm ground, it's an investment for future generations. And you have to be able to look at that way. And the reason we're bringing this up again is because people are concerned. Okay, well, I talked to you a little bit ago about coming on this episode with us and about people's concern about Bill Gates owning farm ground. Just like that keeps flagging in my mind because that's what people keep spouting on social media, right? And you're like, well, you talking about like a farm stand, vegetable stand, or are you talking about like what we do? And I said, I don't know. Maybe people on social media are talking about the farm vegetable stand, but that's not what they are talking about. Even if that's what they think they're talking about, that's not what Bill Gates owns. He's owning big pieces of farm ground like what we do, or potentially pasture, cattle grazing, that kind of thing, right? So,
and like around here is not as much pasture and grazing. It's highly productive ground, so it's used for row crops. That's the most you can earn the most money doing that, and that's what it's basically all come down to. Like when I was a kid, we had a hogs confined hog operation, and we got out of the hogs, it's been 20, 25 plus years ago, and then kind of moved into the specialty production of, corn and soybeans, kind of trying to make more money into that. But, around here, it's row crops. That's where the money's at. But,
and when I think of like Bill Gates and the things that he says he values. It's hard for me to imagine him owning like cattle grazing operations. But of course, money talks. So if that's going to make him money, I'm sure he will. Whereas the row crops, he could probably more easily justify that just from the perspective of climate. I don't know. But yeah, interesting for me.
Well, I think that's one of the
that.
fears too, is what will happen to the ground, especially as all these energy independence things emerge. But so the investment, though, can we talk to that for just a second? When you talk about penciling out a farmer buying farm ground and the fact that they're having to borrow money and the interest rates at what they're at versus somebody who can just pay cash, like a Bill Gates, how that changes things.
And that's the investors in the past, handful of, 4 or 5 years, the investors are paying cash for everything. Very, very few of them, if any, paid, had to borrow any money for this. And they were just to hedge against inflation is what they did. And, farm grounds, it's a good investment over the years because it's always, it's real estate. It's always worth something. There's only so much of it, but so like some of these sales, the bigger tracts, it's a lot of cash, and someone that's just in farming, that's a very big number of money to come. It's a large sum to come up with. So chances are you average borrow money,
right?
For it.
The average piece that would sell. Like, again, our type of acreage here is way different than yours. But what would be like if a property came up for sale, farm ground? What's an average acreage size? Or is it really vary?
It varies. It's all over the board. A 40-acre tract to an 80 to 160. And then they just get bigger from there. Hundreds of acres, 1,000 acres. There's been some 1,000-acre sales in the last couple of years.
1,000-acre sales. And so right now, what would you say approximately the price per acre is in your area?
I'm guessing it's starting to level off, but it's been well in the high teens.
Okay. So when you think of that, times 1,000 acres and think of someone paying cash for that versus the small farmer who all of their money is tied up in their land, it really shows how it's so hard to compete.
Yeah. When you pencil that out over the years, it doubles the amount you're paying per acre.
Oh, yeah.
And when you think about like how much you make per acre,
Well, I said 1,000 acres, and there's been some, ones that are just over that, just under that. But that a lot of times those are divided up into smaller tracts. It's just one massive amount of ground that came for sale, and they're going to sell an 80 off of it. They're going to auction off or just start auctioning. And then wherever it stops, you just pick what pieces you want. And sometimes they're all together. Sometimes they've divided them up into smaller tracts to make it, try to get, more local involvement in the auction, basically farmers, trying to buy a piece here or there. But so a lot, you won't usually have a one piece that's that big. A lot of it, makes up, are made up of multiple parcels. But yeah, a lot of 80s, 160s, stuff like that, or kind of in that range.
Still gigantic. Yeah.
Yeah, they're pretty big tracts, and most of it's just tillable ground. There's not like you're buying a quarter of it or 10% of it that's non-tillable. Most of it is tillable acres.
Okay, so there's a couple other things I wanted to ask you about that we've talked about recently. One was how the government subsidizing, you brought this up. I was talking about something else, and you brought up how the risk has been removed essentially for farmers to some degree anyways, because of insurance and subsidies.
Well, I wouldn't say removed. It's crop insurance is, you can buy crop insurance for, whatever you grow, but it is federally subsidized, and it's about 50% subsidized by the government. So it changes the rates of purchasing crop insurance quite a bit when half of it comes from a taxpayer. And so people can take on a lot bigger risk, which I don't know, some people might look at it as that's a big bonus, and some people might, I don't think it's a big bonus. I think I don't think the government should be funding any of it, but it is what it is. I'm guessing it's probably similar this year, and it has been in years past. But like I say, it's been about half of it subsidized. So
the insurance,
the insurance aspect of it. So you can you're just getting, you can buy insurance for crops, which the inputs per acre are astronomical to plant an acre of corn anymore, and just everything's gotten bigger, the dollar wise. I mean,
how much does it cost to plant an acre of corn? Like any?
Well, just seed. Seed per acre is over $100 an acre. The nitrogen for that same acre is over. Last year the average was in our area, more or less our state. It's over $100 for just the nitrogen, and that's not the fertilizer cost. And then you got your chemicals on top of that, herbicides, fungicides. So you're looking well into the, $400 or $500 an acre, probably. Yeah, at least that. And so, and that's just that's not including your machinery or anything, or a lot of the other inputs that are not quite as upfront, but just seed, herbicide, and your insecticide. Your herbicides, fungicides. You're at $400 or $500 at least for that, so it's crazy. But your margin return is just a smaller margin with bigger dollars, bigger checks to write.
And just as someone who's totally naive, what would it be like if you didn't use some of those herbicides, all the sides? Like, what would your crop production look like?
Well, you couldn't control the weeds, would be the main thing. And that would be it. So you'd be basically crop failure.
Right.
This is my main sticking point. Like this, I would love to change that.
Yeah.
Like I don't want any of that.
Sprayer. Yeah,
he doesn't want it either, So, but how do we do that? That's the thing. So,
yeah, I don't know. That's they did it hundreds of years ago, but you farmed a tract of land that was not much bigger in our yard. And there's farmers everywhere, and now there's just not many farmers.
I think that's what keeps coming back to me. Like, I mean, you guys are hearing this episode as like our second episode, I think, or our third, but we've recorded a little bit out of order so we've already had other conversations throughout this series. And one thing that just keeps coming back to me is the amount of farmers that we're losing, and the fact that it's all just turning into bigger farm operations with less farmers. And so when we think of those more, quote, ideal ways of farming, the reason it's impossible is because these farms are just too big. The way we're trying to feed, quote, the world, it's just, this is what we need to do. But the question is it the only way to feed the world? Like, have we gotten so far down this road that there's no going back, right? That's the question. And there's so much that goes into that.
Efficiency, right? Like that's kind of what we've pushed towards an efficiency, doing more with, I say less, but it's not really less because there's more that goes into it now, equipment wise and all of that, but more with less people, right? Because there's not, and this is something we talked about off podcast as we were prepping for this, was just, is it sustainable? Is regenerative farming a sustainable model to actually feed all the people? Or is there some kind of like population control component that comes in that's being unspoken essentially? Or are people going to have to give up the lifestyle that they love and stop pushing for all these new technologies if people decide they want to go back to a different, older style of way where more people are farming? Like there's all these questions because just doing what we're doing now and stopping, the sides, as you said, that's not really feasible.
No,
Well, and it's the trend too, right? It's trending more and more in that one direction. So it's like, not only do people have to make the decision, but enough people need to make a decision if that's what we want to actually reverse the trend. And then there's all that backwards road to take before we even get there, right? Like it's a mind-boggling thing. Like it would not be easy, perhaps even possible. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. Do you have anything to add there? It's just kind of a conundrum.
Yeah, I mean, it just takes lots of labor to do what we used to do, back hundreds of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of labor and small tracts of land to basically cultivate. And I don't know how you change it. But,
well, I think
like I say, we do a lot more with a lot fewer people.
Yeah. But I think also like the condition of the average North American and just the comforts that we're used to, most people would not, first of all, be able to, but even just be willing to do the kind of work that it would take to feed themselves and contribute to feeding their community, right? Like it's so far from the Netflix frame of mind. Like go to work, put in your 8 hours, come home, maybe like have dinner with the kids, watch TV. Like it's just so far from our current reality. And I say our as like the majority of the population. So I think it's like, will people even care? Or will they care only up to the point where they actually have to do something, right? So,
yeah. And I think this is part of it too. The people that, sit on Instagram and say, we should stop spraying. Like I would love that. Like I buy organic vegetables. My husband bought organic fruit for our baby today, like this is what we would like, but it's easy to say that on social media and not know from your apartment in New York what it looks like for somebody actually farming in central Illinois, so I don't know. There's that part too.
Totally.
But the last thing I want to ask you about is Cecily and I both watch World Watch with our kids. And you came home one day and the kids were watching. You came home for lunch. Kids were watching World Watch and they were talking about how this farmer of, coffee was having to, I think he was not going to be able to sell somewhere anymore because he had cut down trees on his property recently. And you're like, whoa, pause that, girls. So just explain that a little bit.
No, I had come home from a meeting the day before.
Yeah,
or
you
something,
had lunch. Yeah.
Anyhow, it was a similar thing, but a local elevator that we sell grain to and have for decades and generations before me has said we had to meet with somebody, and they said in order to haul to this elevator in the fall, you have to be certified as a non-deforestation farm. Like, okay, and they're going to pay you a little bit more per bushel to do that, which is great. But so how's this come about in the location we're at? And I think I could be wrong on this. I think it came from the EU, but selling grain overseas, and they wanted to make sure that they can track this grain and prove that it didn't come from a farm that had, I think it was like 1% deforestation or more. So you had to be under that threshold. And so you had to certify sign up all your farms if you're going to haul into this elevator, which is, I was like, okay, so what's this entail? Which they do it all by satellite imaging, and where there's no deforestation here where we live.
We don't have any trees.
Yeah, it's just, there's not much trees.
Yeah,
that's
it's
interesting.
Just farm ground.
Yeah.
So it was pretty simple, and like I say, they're doing it by satellite imaging, and we just had to give them all the farms and already had all this stuff pretty much loaded. So it wasn't a big deal for us, but it was kind of shocking to me that this elevator that I'm talking about, they had a handful of them that they picked from this company that were all going to be in this program, and they're keeping the grain all segregated. I guess to ship to Europe, but they said they will reject a semi-load of crop coming into the elevator if you're not on the list and haven't been pre-approved.
Wow.
But it was the exact same thing that the girls were watching on the World Watch, like the next day, other than this guy's wherever he was from, but talking about coffee, and we're in
Crazy.
Central
The interesting,
America. And
yeah,
here,
the interesting part, or how it
the
ties
Midwest,
in, is
the heart of
just
America, and it's just the exact same thing. And it just kind of caught me off guard.
yeah,
Totally.
yeah. Well, just the fact that it's the United Nations agenda being played out in the EU. I don't know. I asked you, and I don't really make the connection of how we're not impacted because we're part of the UN as well. Like how we in America aren't participating in the deforestation thing. But regardless, it's this green agenda being acted out in a way that it's controlling farmers and how they manage their farm ground to be able to sell their crop.
Yeah. So it's control, but it's also deception in a way, because now Europe or whoever is selling this as like deforestation, not certified. Whereas you guys,
nothing's changed.
Yeah, nothing's changed.
Yes.
You just have this certification. Whereas someone else who maybe lives like in the mountains of Tennessee or something is chopping down a whole bunch of trees just to make their land farmable, but they're also doing a whole bunch to maybe increase soil health and the amount of carbon that can be sequestered there. And it's just like,
exactly.
This is such deception. And it just, this is just what makes me so angry.
It's just like slapping non-GMO on a product that's never been GMO, or slapping whole grain on a bag of popcorn. Like, it is the whole grain.
It's the whole thing. Yeah.
But people will pay more because, they don't have the knowledge behind it.
The way I understood it, I tried to look up the information. I threw it away or whatever, but I don't think they'll let any grain come into the certain countries in Europe if it is not, already approved through this program. The way I understand it, like they will not let ships in, I think, that are loaded with grain that are not approved.
Wow.
So maybe they're not labeling it for the consumer, but either way they are, because they're telling people it's no deforestation.
Well, and it also just makes me wonder, like, what happens when the next global crisis happens and they need to get food there, and the only thing we have is from farms that are like, don't have this certification. Obviously, that's not necessarily something that's going to happen, but it could. Like, think of when the war in Ukraine started. They were all this talk about how they're this major exporter of wheat, and everyone was going to be hungry because of Ukraine not being able to produce. And it's like, so that didn't really come to fruition, but these things could. And then the decision has to be made. Well, what's more important, feeding the countries of Europe or forgetting about, I don't know.
You got any other questions?
I don't know. Always have good conversations about this at home, but I don't know. I figured he'd be good to.
No, for sure.
I don't know. Cecily's actually the one that's been bugging to have you on. I've just been relaying the message.
I'm just the kind of Rita knows this about me, and maybe she's told you in her moments of frustration about me. But as soon as we have an idea, and I think it's a good one, I was like, oh, having Levi's on, such a great idea. I'm like, we need to get that locked in. Like, let's just make this decision. Yeah. So as many times as she asked you, it was probably me pushing her. Like, Levi said yes yet? And what time are we doing this?
Yeah, I think last week he said, Cecily wants to know what time we're on for next week. I'm like,
yeah, I'm a jumper. I'm like, let's just do it right now. Yeah, well, we appreciate it. And I did learn a lot. Like I said, this type of farming is not common where I live. But obviously we receive the benefits of it through the food that we can't, really produce all of that here. But we do eat it. So it's good for me to know more about a type of farming that I don't know about, but still benefit from. And also good for people to just have a deeper understanding of this whole world. Like, I just think when you live urban, even if you try, it's really hard to understand what goes on unless someone just tells you. And I think that's one of our goals with this series, is just to kind of remove that veil so that people can see the facts, and then from that point, make a decision about how they want to source their food.
Yeah. Yeah. And do people want to understand, really, you know?
Because, when you truly understand, you have to decide.
But
yeah.
There's a lot to it.
Yeah. Actually, we were just doing a Bible study with the kids before we came on here. And we learned about the Hebrew word Shema, which means like to listen and obey. So in that Deuteronomy 6, verse 6, it starts with, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." And then it goes on to give all these commands in this prayer of Shema. They call it prayer of Shema because it starts with that word hear. And I'm like, man, I got to start using that word listen and obey, Shema, with my kids so that they actually do what I tell them to. But it applies in this as well, because people need to understand, or they say they want to. But when you hear information, then you actually have to take some action with it. Otherwise, you're like a hypocrite, right? Like it says in James, you're the person that looks at themselves in the mirror and then immediately forgets what they look like. So I guess that's kind of what Rita and I have always wanted. We're like, just bring some information to people so that they can make choices that align with their values. And hopefully that's working its way out in this series.
Yep.
All right. Okay. Well, thanks, Levi. Yeah. You don't have social media, so we won't ask you where people can find you. That's what we always do.
That is correct.
All right.
This podcast series is all about connecting you back with your local farmer. And one great way to do that is barn to door. Recently, I was looking specifically for grass-fed beef for my family, and I found a local farmer and purchased beef through their website. Their website was powered by barn to door. I didn't know it at the time, but putting those things together, I realized this is a really great way for consumers to connect to their local farmer, but also for farmers to be able to power their website and get their product to the consumer who's looking for it. So digging in more, I was intrigued to learn that Barn to Door actually powers thousands of farmers across all 50 states, selling to more than 1 million people. If you're a farmer looking to improve your brand presence and make it easy for buyers to purchase from you, go to barntodoor.com to learn more. If you're a buyer or consumer like me looking to purchase from a local farmer, then go to localfarmfinder.com to discover farmers in your own community. We love supporting small businesses. We love good, clean products. I mean, it matters for your food, but it also matters when you talk about what you're putting on your body and the products you're using in your home and for cleaning. Rocasa Organics is a great company for that. It's a small company, and it also just is a company that has good, clean products you can be happy to bring in your home and use with your family.
I like to pitch one Rocasa product like every time we record an ad for them. And this week, I want to pitch their all-purpose spray. It comes in like a multi-surface cleaner concentrate is what I have. And then you can just mix it yourself and it goes a long way. It smells great and it literally makes my kitchen shine. And I saw an Instagram reel that they did where it actually cleans better than Lysol. So that's what I would recommend that you try out this time. So go to rocasaorganics.com, enter the code BOOMCLAP, and save 20% off your first order.
All right, Mary, thank you so much for joining us today. I know it's always
my pleasure.
It's always a pleasure to have conversation with you and just hear what's going on in Washington. And I don't know, it's just interesting because your perspective is a lot different because you're involved in the politics of things now. All right, so we wanted to cover today mostly just barriers to farm families hanging onto farm ground and why outside investors are more heavily coming in and buying up farm ground. And that's just part of the food supply challenge. So a couple things I wanted to talk to with you is the ag lobby, like big ag, if you can kind of explain that to people. And then also, there's a lot we could talk to you about, but I think the climate agenda and how that is making it harder for farmers to be able to keep their farm ground and things coming our way with that. So I don't know if you want to start with the ag lobby a little bit.
Sure. I don't really know what you want me to say about the ag lobby, but
whatever you have to say.
Okay. Well, it's a fact that lobbyists are impactful on how your elected representatives vote. And so the bottom line is, here in America, our government is set up where power is by the people, for the people, of the people, by the people, and for the people. And when the people abdicate their responsibility to hold their elected officials, accountable for their votes, you're going to have a lot of, you're going to have the lobby having undue influence. And so bottom line, to me, the way to stop it is to hold the elected officials responsible for their votes.
Oh,
That's such a good point.
I mean, I think it's okay for people to represent their interests or their companies. That's fine. But, for me, I represent the Illinois 15, and I represent, I'm a constitutionalist. And so people need to hold me accountable for that. And then I think you'll be able to see the power of the lobby ratcheted back.
Yeah. Well, I think it's so easy for people to blame the government, right? That's what we hear all the time. Blame the government, blame the government. But you working in the government makes such a good point. Like, it's up to the people to hold the government responsible. And that's a lot harder for people, right? Like, it's so easy to just abdicate the responsibility and blame someone else. But that's not how the system was meant to work.
Well, and it's hard because the truth is under layers of lies. And I say all the time, one of the things I've noticed out here is our country's under a spirit of deception, whether it's from elected officials or legacy media, just people lying all the time. And there's so many frauds that are representing people. And they'll say sometimes we have multiple votes on an issue. And depending on who they're talking to, they'll highlight the vote they made this time versus another vote. And so it is hard, but people are going to have to put out effort to find out the truth about their elected officials' voting record. And then they need to hold them accountable. And I want to say primaries are so important. That's the time to replace your elected official if they're not, holding up to what they promised to do.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I will say I get on and I look and see how you voted. I do.
Yeah.
I mean, I do that.
Well, and I have had people call me that have been upset over a vote. And I'm thinking of one particular time this man called, I could tell he was almost angry. And the first thing I said to him is, thank you so much for paying attention and for contacting me. I appreciate it, because this is the only way our government is going to function properly, is when the people, hold their elected officials accountable. And then after I finished that, I proceeded to tell him that every bill that Nancy Pelosi put on the floor was named the opposite of what the bill actually was. And I explained to him that my vote was actually the opposite of what he thought it was. So,
because you were voting on the content of the bill, not the title of the bill.
Yes.
Yeah. That's so interesting. So,
but there are so many great organizations, Heritage Foundation. There's something called Liberty Score, where you can pull up the map of the United States, touch your state, and then you can look whether it's a state or federal employee, and or elected representative, and you could see their voting record. And you could see the votes they took and how, basically a little explanation of the bill.
Yeah, that's really good. I'm going to have to check if Canada has something similar, and I'm sure they do. But I have found, like, there's been times where I've reached out to, we have MPs, like members of parliament, and either don't hear anything back or get like some sort of form letter back. Like, it's really, you feel like you're knocking your head against a wall.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's the same there in any way, or if you're just a particularly good congresswoman. But it's frustrating at times.
So I have excellent staff, and I know we're super responsive, and I get great feedback about how we're serving our constituents. And I also have to say that when we're getting ready to make a hard vote or a controversial vote, we are paying attention to the phones and the emails that are coming in, because we want to know what people think about it. So, that's the kind of elected official people should have.
Absolutely.
They should demand that.
Well, how do you represent the people if you don't know what the people think, right?
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So when I talked to you the other day, you mentioned you wanted to talk about the climate a little bit, agenda in coordination with farming. And I was like, good, because this is a heavy part of this podcast series, because it really is a pressing issue within farming. So I guess, what do you have to add there with climate, but also how legislation is coming that is going to affect farmers?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'd like to say to the listeners or viewers that my husband and I have been farming for almost 45 years, and we're neighbors with Rita. We are actually conservation farmers. We believe that, God has allowed us to be a steward over the land. Mm-hmm. And I'm one of the few actual farmers in Congress and on the Ag Committee. So I'm on the Ag Committee. So I understand the challenges that are faced by family farms, especially the small to medium size. And I also believe that people want to preserve the family farm and they don't want corporate farms. And what we're seeing more and more, especially with the kind of all kinds of legislation that has unintended consequences sometimes, and then rules and regulations, that it is causing consolidation in the ag industry. And then also we have globalists that are impactful in our politics, and they have an agenda which is totalitarian control. And, once you control the food, you can control the people. Yeah. And they're using this climate, the sham climate issue to push totalitarianism. And I've heard that the communists weren't gaining ground in our country. And so they went into the environmental, the environmental movement. And then now they've really gotten a foothold, since Al Gore and some of them. And I never call it the Green New Deal. I call it the Green Bad Deal because it's a bad deal for anybody that likes to eat and wants to be able to pay their bills and wants to hold on to the family farm. I think you can watch what's happened in the Netherlands, which the Netherlands is the breadbasket for Europe. And they've definitely gone after agriculture there. They're going after their ability to use fertilizer. They're overtaxing the farms. They're penalizing them for their practices if they aren't in line with their green agenda, which, by the way, net zero will never happen because net zero means cease to exist. And anybody that understands photosynthesis understands that green leafy plants need CO2 in order to grow and thrive. And actually, as farmers, we know that higher levels of CO2 cause our crops to actually produce more. So, we've got regulation. And now they're subsidizing this green energy, which what you see in rural areas is they're blanketing like Class A and Class B fertile farm ground, the best ground in the world. We're seeing it by us with solar panel farms, which are not green whatsoever. They help China. They don't produce reliable or affordable energy. But I actually have a bill to prohibit solar panels from being allowed on Class A and Class B farm ground because that's a great resource that we can't make more of. But the other problem with that is the people that are signing up for these solar panels are, because of government subsidies, or basically you and I paying for it, they are making over $1,000 an acre to put solar panels on their ground. And so, that just drives the cost of renting ground up. And it's almost becoming a culture of serfdom. We bought land, decades ago, and it was hard to be able to make the payments on it. But today, it's virtually impossible for someone that's in agriculture to be able to look at the bottom line of purchasing ground. By us, ground is going for easy between 15 and 20,000 an acre. And there's no way you can pencil that out. But people that aren't even in production agriculture, like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett or China is trying to come in and buy up our farm ground. They're bringing money in from non-ag sources and purchasing our ground, which, I have another bill to prohibit China from being able to buy up China or our adversaries, any adversary, from being able to buy our farm ground.
Okay, so I have
go ahead. You go ahead,
okay, I have a couple of things to say. One is here in our community, or my neighboring community, I should say, we have ALR. I don't know if you guys have the same thing, but Agricultural Land Reserve. So that land is reserved for agricultural purposes. And we recently had a Coors, I think it's Coors, which is a beer manufacturing facility,
Coors,
put on this ALR land because it's apparently food production. So that's more in that spirit of deception that you were talking about. That just made me so angry. Because anything else you try to do with ALR to like change the way you're doing stuff is extremely difficult, but somehow we're making beer and calling that good. But you had mentioned this totalitarian agenda. There are still so many wonderful, amazing, smart people that just don't believe that. They'll say things like, but why would anyone want to do that? Why would anyone want to, take over the world, essentially? So people are needing evidence. So what are some things that you've seen in your work that can show people like this is actually happening? Yeah. I know there's so much, but we
the green agenda funding the solar panels and windmills and shutting down our, we have, biofuels, gas, oil, coal, nuclear, the reliable, affordable energy choices. And people need to realize that all of those things, every battery is helping China conquer the world. Yeah. And people look at their human rights record. We don't want them ruling the world. That's one thing. And then I think, allowing consolidation in industries. My husband and I also have a cow-calf operation, and definitely they're after beef. They are after all proteins, but especially beef. And I got to thinking it's not just because we raise beef. I do eat a lot of beef. I raised my children on whole milk and beef and full fat diet, and everybody's thin. But beef makes you strong. And I had this thought one day that the government, the powers that be, want weak people. And they want us to be weak spiritually, emotionally. Look, now public school has got a big agenda for emotional learning. They want us weak relationally. They're dividing us based on the melanin in our skin. They want us weak intellectually. I mean, the public schools are struggling to, they don't have kids up to speed on reading or math, basic skills, and they can control weak people. And, meat makes you strong. And I know it's been a while ago when AOC first rolled out her green agenda, where we were all going to hoof it or ride a bike, and they were going to do away with air travel, whatever. And we laughed at her. But today we are being forced to pay for this agenda and adjust our lives and our businesses with it. And when they say they have plans to do away with cows because of methane gas, which is a no threat to us at all, and they want us to eat beets and lab-grown meat, I want to tell people they are serious. They have this agenda planned out for us. And I can guarantee you that they will be dining on filet mignon, just like they fly their private jets to their little conferences wherever, to talk about the sham climate issue and basically taking control of the world.
Yeah.
That was laid out
people need to wake up.
Yeah. That was laid out well. Well, you do have a beautiful cow-calf operation. Yesterday, I drove out your way to your daughter's house and drove by your house, and it's so pretty. So pretty.
And we don't use hormones or antibiotics. They're out in the sun, they're eating grass. And, smaller farms have the benefit that we can look at our animals every day, and we don't have to just put antibiotics in our feed because there's no way we could see if an animal was sick. Like, we are truly, caring for our animals in the best possible way. And I think you lose that when you get into super giant operations. And, I think too, this is a whole nother subject, but is the taxation on inheritance tax and capital gains tax. And, it's besides the regulation, the taxation is very oppressive and will prohibit families from being able to pass on not just their farms, but their family business. And, I believe one of the things that we can use to strengthen the families, which is one of the foundations of a healthy culture, is to be able to pass inheritance on to our children and pass our family businesses and our skills on to the next generation.
Yeah. Well, the billionaires are doing it because they have foundations and things that they funnel money through. But it's really hard for the people who are doing good for their families, but not in that really upper class, right? It's really hard for people just doing well. So anyway.
Which is why elections are so important. Yes. Elections have consequences. And, I just want to urge people to really pay attention to look up whoever represents you, look up their voting record, and then you have a realm of influence. Get out there and talk to people about what your representative's doing. And just, if they're not doing a good job representing you, find a good candidate and get behind them. And I know it's sad to say, but money is the mother's milk of politics. And the left has so much more money than conservatives do. And people are going to have to put out their time and their money and their talents and help good people get elected. And I do have one other topic. It's not on ag, but tomorrow there's going to be a hearing and that education secretary is going to be in. And I'm planning to talk to him about the rule that they put out concerning Title IX. So everybody knows Title IX was originally put in place to give our girls and women opportunities in athletics and opportunities to get scholarships. And so sex in Title IX, when it was established, meant biological sex, like reality. Well, now they want to say that sex has to do with sexual identity. And Joe Biden and the education secretary are bullying Americans because Americans they refuse to deny reality and say that a man can become a woman or that it's fair for a man to participate in athletics, in an athletic competition against a girl. And they also don't want men and boys in their daughters' showers and locker rooms or athletic teams. So I'm going to be questioning them about that. And then also the risk that there is to teachers and other employees in schools and students if they accidentally misgender someone. And I know in Wisconsin, there was there's just all kinds of sad cases involving the transgender thing, but a boy misgendered another student at a lunch table, and he was suspended from school. Wow. The mother was called and told her son was being suspended for sexual harassment. He was in junior high. And she said just like her mind was just going crazy. What has my son done? And come to find out, he accidentally used the wrong pronoun of the day, basically, because people can change their pronouns from day to day. Yeah. But it is a disaster for our daughters, especially. Our girls aren't going to be safe. I've met with girls that have been severely injured in athletic competitions where a man has been participating. We all know Riley Gaines' story. But anyway, we're going to have that hearing tomorrow, and I'm going to be questioning him and holding his feet to the fire. So
we appreciate your willingness to do that. Like you said, it's that spirit of deception. Yeah. It runs through the whole thing.
You need to start saying, you say like green, you don't say Green New Deal, you say Green Bad Deal. You need to say, instead of misgendered, you say correctly gendered.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I like that.
I don't know. Just a thought.
We definitely need to look at the tactics of the left. Yeah. We're going to have to, because they've stolen our words, and they've stolen our symbol, like the rainbow, was God's sign, a great promise to us. And yes, we do need to consider how we can use language against them like they've used it against us.
While maintaining truth.
Good one.
Right? Exactly.
While maintaining
Yes.
truth. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right,
Well,
Mary,
we really
thank you so
appreciate that.
much. We appreciate
You're
you coming
welcome.
on. We know you got to go, but just before you go, can you outline those two bills, the bill numbers, so people can look them up that you mentioned you have coming? One about
Okay.
China, if you have them. If not, we'll just put them in our show notes. You want to text them to me?
Okay. So it's HR 840. That's Saving American Farms from Adversaries Act. And then the solar panel is, here it is, HR 4257. And then I do have one, the first bill I introduced, Safety and Opportunity for Girls Act, which is to stand up for our girls in private spaces and in athletics. It's HR 935.
Thanks so much for coming on, Mary.
You're welcome. I appreciate what you're doing. I always say that whoever controls the information controls the people, and appreciate what you're doing to try to get truth out there.
Yeah.
Thank you. We appreciate that.
Okay.
Okay.
Take care.
All right. Have a good day.
This was episode 3 in our 5-part series on food supply. We hope it got you thinking more about your food supply, the safety and quality of your food, and the stewardship in the growth and production of your food. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of this series or our upcoming deep dive series, and leave a 5-star review and share this episode with a friend. You can find out how to connect with us in our show notes. Thanks for listening to the Boom Clap podcast, where culture and conviction collide.